IPM, typically, I don't think this is in the presentation, our typical process time is a year to 18 months, so 12 to 18 months, and that oftentimes will depend on how quickly you're able to find the right pastor. Sometimes that can happen very quickly, sometimes it does not happen as quickly as we would like, but our commitment is to work with you through that process. Even though we say 12 to 18 months, it's not that we're done and out of here at that point. My personal commitment is to stay until you have a new man here. Who whenever that might be. It's rare to go much beyond the 18 months. We do have some men, and I don't know the reasons, but I do know that we've got some men who have been in the church. They have been willing to stay for 2+ years. I don't know if that's because there were problems in the church or if there's some sort of unique situation in trying to find the right man. I have no idea. But that's the kind of commitment that we make, is that we're going to be coming and we're going to be staying. We will be relocating here, sort of. We'll be in rental housing that the church will need to provide, and your elders and deacons are already working on that. But we'll move here, but we're not moving a household here. One of the things that we do ask, and I try to say this up front, is if you do decide to call us, our desire is, even though we know we're only going to be here temporarily, we want to become a part of the family. We want to become part of your family. And so we're hopeful that will happen, and that's what we look forward to happening. So having said that, I think that's probably enough. Let's begin, and I'll take you through the presentation, and then if we have time at the end, and that will be totally dependent on you. I don't have anything else to do this afternoon except drive back to Ohio. There's no football games on that I'm aware of, so that's next week. Okay, IPM. Beginning, why does a pastor leave? Well, a lot of reasons. Oftentimes it's because they're called to a new church or to a new ministry. That's exactly what you all have experienced. David has been called to a new ministry, a ministry that I'm somewhat familiar with and am very impressed with. So it's a great ministry to the people who serve in our governments, particularly at the state levels. Sometimes a pastor leaves because of declining effectiveness. Nobody likes that, and no pastor likes to admit it, but every pastor has to face the fact sometimes that their giftedness does not fit the needs of the congregation where they're serving anymore, and so they can lose effectiveness. Sometimes there are personal or family issues, not negative ones, sometimes health issues, sometimes extended family issues that make it necessary for a pastor to leave. Unfortunately, there are those times when it's conflict between the leadership of the church and the pastor. We go into those kinds of churches too. About 25, right now we've got about 80 men in churches, and the last statistic I saw was there's about 15 churches that are kind of in the process where you are, that they're looking at calling someone. We've served over, I think the statistic here is going to say 1,800 churches in the course of our history. And about 25% of our men do what we call traditional interims. That means they come in and they kind of preach and they try to keep all the programs going, but they're not really working with the congregation in terms of any movement in the congregation. What I would be doing is coming as what we call it an intentional intern, where I come with the idea of helping you as a congregation to move forward and get prepared for whatever and whoever comes next. But sometimes, that's why I get into that, sometimes the conflict with leadership or church, we get into those kinds of situations too. I haven't seen, from the little bit that I've seen, I know that no church is totally devoid of that, but I haven't seen that as the major issue here, as it is in some churches we get into. Sometimes there's a forced or even a pressured resignation, and then sometimes retirement. The last churches that I was at, I left because I retired and couldn't stay retired and ended up getting into this ministry. Okay. So that's why a pastor leaves. And the result of his leaving results in a lot of different emotions on the part of the people. And here's a few of them. They may feel lost. They may feel confused. They may feel unsure about the future, unclear, perplexed, disoriented, bewildered, all of those kinds of things. One that's not up there, that if I were designing the slide, it would be up there, is there may be some who feel relief. Because we as pastors recognize that we do not necessarily please all the people all the time. In fact, we really don't. That's not our goal. If we're really serving the Lord, is is to please people all the time. But we also recognize that there are times in ministry when they call it a popularity vote or popularity count or whatever in politics. That the popularity of the pastor can go up and down as different things happen. And so sometimes there is some relief over the pastor leaving. Sometimes there's just an acknowledgement that it's healthiest for the pastor, it's healthiest for the congregation to leave. So while these all are kind of sound sort of negative, those are the ones that are oftentimes destructive in a church. And so churches will sometimes respond in numerous ways. One of those is they go into a holding pattern. This is the church who says, we just want to hold on to everybody. We want to keep whatever the money is that's coming in. We want to keep that money coming in. We want to make sure we don't lose anybody. And so we're just going to try to go into a holding pattern. And usually when they do that, they begin to look for a pastor immediately. And the truth of the matter is oftentimes call the wrong man. Not a bad man, just the wrong man for them. Because they're looking, they're desperate to find someone. They sometimes will lose momentum. We find in many of our interns, we find that during this interim period, during this transition period, that churches will oftentimes continue to grow even numerically during the time when there is no senior pastor, simply because they're working together as a group and they're moving forward. And that's attractive to people. But sometimes they'll lose momentum. Sometimes there can become a power vacuum, depending how strong the pastor was. And so there can be a power vacuum that develops that leads to power struggles within the congregation. Sometimes they try to save money, and they bring in guest speakers, or hire someone as what in our PCA polity we would call a stated supply, whose really only real job is to be there on Sunday mornings to preach and to teach. Is not really a stated supply, is not really hired to pastor. If you call me, IPM comes in, we're going to do this process. I'm also going to take on some of the responsibilities of what you would call a senior pastor. I would be the primary preacher, the one who's responsible for that and for teaching. What I'm not going to be doing, though, is giving the kind of guidance and leadership in terms of vision for the congregation that you might expect a new senior pastor coming in to give. You're not particularly interested in my vision. What we're interested in here is your vision for what God wants you to do as a congregation. I'm not going to hesitate to share my ideas, but it's not my vision that I'm going to be putting forward. And a lot of times, one of the things that churches do, I'm not sure if it's up here or not, they call a pastor as soon as possible, and they speak about choosing unwisely. They oftentimes choose foolishly. They'll oftentimes go for the man who is the most gregarious and easy to get along with, who may be the best preacher, the best public speaker, who may have some other gifts. But my experience, and I'll share this with you, it's not in the slide presentation, but my experience in ministry, and some of you I'm sure have experienced it in your professions, is that you get called in because you are, quote, an expert at something, because you have something that this group wants, and within 6 months, as you're exercising that something, the group decides they don't want that, or they've got better ideas. I've often said, that churches, they have this tendency to call a pastor because, man, this guy got some great ideas, and 6 months down the road, everybody in the congregation has a better idea than the pastor. It just happens. And sometimes that happens because of some of these things that have been going on. So our goal is to try to help prevent that from happening. Pastor Jerry mentioned how oftentimes a man who comes in after a man who's been here for a long time, and then a new man comes in, how he'll become cannon fodder. And it's very, very often the case that a year or two is all that they're able to survive. And there's been so much controversy because we've always done it this way. This is the way Pastor Dave did it. This is the way we've done it for 20 years. And so now you bring a new man in, and you don't have an idea where you're going. You just know what you've done. But he has some ideas. And so when he tries to institute those, almost always it leads to conflict. And it may lead to division within the congregation. So you don't want to make that mistake of calling someone too soon. And then oftentimes there's also a failure to follow up visitors or to care for hurting members. The leadership, without a pastor, the leadership can get very, very, very drained and pulled in any number of directions, and not have the really not have the time, capability, or the resources to provide care for the members of the congregation. So those are just some typical things that happen. We believe there's a better way to transition between pastors. We think transition is a season of renewal and transformation. This next year to year and a half, whatever it might be, can be for you a time of excitement as you renew what it is that God's called you to do. As you look at, okay, this is what we've done, this is how far we've come, where's God want us to go in the next? And we may look out 20 years. Where does God want us to be in the next 20 years? What's he want us to look like? So hopefully it will be a time of renewal and transformation. Our goal is to create a healthier, more effective church characterized by life and vitality. I always tell people, realize that's not saying this is not a healthy church. That's not saying this is not a church characterized by life and vitality. But the simple matter of fact is that no matter how healthy we are, no matter how full of life and vitality we are, there's always room for improvement. That's true both individually and it's true corporately. And so our goal is to simply help you to become a church that is more like that, that's more characterized by those things. We want you to be able to welcome a new senior pastor to a healthy, functional, spiritually renewed church community. We do not want your new pastor having to come in and spend his first 6 months putting out fires. Whatever those fires are, part of my job would be to try to put them out, or to try to do whatever needs to be done to resolve them. Because we talk about it as capital. Every pastor comes in with a certain amount of capital, and you expend that. You might call it people's goodwill, and you expend that. And if your new pastor's coming in and he's expending all of his capital on dealing with these issues that could have and should have been dealt with before he ever even got there, you've got a wounded pastor. And that wound, even if he survives more than a year or two, that woundedness may linger for years and years and years. So it's our goal to make sure that we've done everything we can. We're not perfect. We don't profess to bring perfection. But our goal is to help you be ready to welcome a senior pastor to a church that's healthy, functionally, that's a spiritually renewed church community. So if I were to come here, my goal is for Mount Airy. I'd want to see a church healthy enough for people to experience God, for them to grow in grace together, to serve each other, and to reach their community. Those 4 things. Now, it's not up to me to make that happen. But part of my objective, part of my goal is to see you, and through your leaders, to see that beginning to happen. A church that is united in its understanding of elder leadership and pastoral leadership. This is a PCA church. Praise God for that. I'm so thankful to even have the opportunity to be considered to come into a PCA church. And that tells me a lot. It doesn't tell me everything, but that tells me a lot about this church's understanding of elder leadership and pastoral leadership. And so this particular thing may just be a matter of fine-tuning some things. Or I may say there's nothing to fine-tune even. That all depends on where you are. I don't know where you are. And a church safe and stable enough for a new pastor to be embraced by the congregation and to equip that congregation to serve and to reach their community. Okay. One of the worst scenarios, in fact, most pastors, if they're worth their salt, at least in my opinion, will not come to a church where the vote for them is divided. Every pastor kind of has his own threshold, but 80 to 90%, and my desire has always been, take your first vote on me, and if it's not unanimous, see if you can get it to be unanimous. See if those who voted against me will concur that we believe this is what God's doing, even though I may have some reservations. Okay, because it's tough enough coming into a new congregation as any pastor, and it's even tougher when you're coming in and you've got even if it's a small number, even if it's only 5 people or 10 people or whatever, who really don't want you there, a lot of men would turn that down simply because, say, it's a battle not worth fighting. So anyhow, that's what we're talking about, where the congregation is safe and stable enough to welcome a new pastor. We use a 5-stage process, and I'm going to go over it quickly, and then I'll go back and go with a little bit more detail in them. The first stage is to connect with the people. The second stage is to assess the church's health. And I'm going to come back and tell you how we do these. But to assess the church health, then having done those, to seek to facilitate action, then to lead through the strategic planning, and to coach the pastor search team. Those are very neat when they're up on the screen. In reality, it's not step 1 and that's done, and now you move to step 2. There's overlap, and you may be out in step 3 and have to go back and do some things with step 1. I mean, it's a little bit more fluid than it looks. But that is the model. Those are the railroad tracks that we try to follow in the 5-stage process. So let me go through that now. The connect part, the very first part. I will spend the first 2 to 3 months of my time primarily doing what I call them getting to know you interviews. They're pretty intensive, extensive interviews with each individual and or couple in the congregation. We set up an appointment. I've got a series of questions so that I'm kind of getting the same information from people, but I'm trying to get a feel for not only the individuals, but also for the congregation as a whole, and how different individuals and couples within the congregation perceive that. I'm looking for trends. I'm looking for attitudes. I'm looking for whatever may be common threads as I do that. So intensive interviewing. I begin with the staff and the leaders and then the members. So that would be the first 3 months. And we usually tell people, don't expect to see much happening those first 3 months. We're still all getting to know each other. When you as a congregation sign a contract with IPM, I work for IPM. I don't work for the congregation. You sign the contract with IPM. You call me. They recommend to me. You call me. I come and I start working. That contract is a 3-month contract. Some people make the mistake of thinking, "Oh, you're going to be done in 3 months." No, that 3 months gives us an escape clause. If you decide, this isn't working, or if I decide I can't deal with these people, each of us have a way out. But I will say this: if you cut the process short, whether it's at 3 months, and then the contract stays in force, but it goes month to month after that, just kind of like a rental. And that's to continue on until we have a new pastor in place. If at some point the church decides they're going to cut that process short at the 3 months or at some other point, it is a lose-lose situation. All of the work that has been done will have been for naught, and what yet remains to be done will probably not get done. If you're willing to get it done, you'll keep the person here who's doing it for you and leading you through it. And so to get rid of that person or to end the contract with IPM early is usually a lose-lose situation. And we, as me as the pastor, or my family, we leave feeling like we've lost too, because we've invested 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 10 months, whatever it might be, and then to have it cut off, we say, why'd we go there? And the truth of the matter is, we're smart enough to know that God is big enough that even in that situation, He uses us. It's not totally wasted, but so much benefit is gone. So I just want to make sure that the congregation is clear. We're talking typically 12 to 18 months in time, even though the contract only says 3. Okay, and what is it, Ken? What is it? If was it Kent? What happens if we cancel it after 3? Who wins? Nobody. Okay. That we're all committed to that process. And I'll do my best. If you call me, I will do my best to try to keep you informed of where we are in the process. But sometimes I get so involved in the process, I forget to tell people where we are. So you always have the option of asking. I will be preaching on themes that are relevant to the church's needs. I was asked this question yesterday. IPM does not give us a list of sermons that we're supposed to preach. I believe so strongly in the preaching of the Word and the authority of that and the responsibility of that, that I will try my best to do preaching that is geared to meeting this congregation's needs. That may have to do with some of the IPM process, but it may not. It may simply be this is something that the congregation, in my opinion, as the interim pastor, needs to hear. And so it will be relevant to the church's needs, but you may at times say, well, how's this relevant to this process we're going through? And the answer to that may be it's not particularly. But hopefully, through the input I get from each of you, if I come, from the input I get from each of you and the input I get from your elders and deacons, I'll be able to be preaching on those subjects and topics that are helpful and relevant to you. I predominantly do verse-by-verse expositional preaching because I'm here only short-term. We're not going to start the book of Romans and try to go through the book of Romans. I spent 3 years going through the book of Romans and only got to chapter 11. So we're not going to try to pick up Romans and do it verse by verse, at least not in that kind of detail. But you can expect that I would be preaching some shorter series that are expositional. That's not to say I don't do any topical. Are you all familiar with the difference between what we mean by expositional and topical? I do some topical from time to time, but that's not my forte. This process can involve some conflict counseling, mediation, management, depending what I find. There may be a need for that, but that would go on during this first connect stage. And then during this stage, I would be forming what we call a transition team. A transition team, and at this point I'm not going to tell you how many because I don't know, but a transition team will be a number of people from the congregation whose job is going to be to meet. Typically we meet weekly, and they'll move through the process now of taking this data that I've accumulated in my interviews. The next one coming is assess the church health. We'll do a church survey. There's a number of things, material that we're going to do. We will be purchasing a demographics study of probably of the zip code area, maybe the area code area, whatever seems to work the best for where your target audience is. But they're going to work through all of that. They're going to be looking at, okay, where have we been as a church? Are there any issues we need to address because of where we've been? And where do we think we need to go? And they will come up with that. That will go to your session. We don't bypass the session. That will go to the session for input, approval, acceptance, adoption, whatever, and come back to the congregation as, okay, here, this will now set kind of the goals and objectives for the next period of time. The transition team begins that process, and that will move us into, wrong button. That will move us into stage 2, which is the church self-study. Transition team is now in place. They'll meet regularly, there for 5 to 6 months to identify key issues, plan needed changes, and prepare for a future. And under that, they'll come to terms with Mount Airy's history. I don't know what that means, but you have a history. You've been around for 20 to 30 years. I know you have a history. So we'll come to terms with anything there that needs to be dealt with. We'll examine what are Mount Airy's needs. You all, as a congregation, have certain needs. We'll assess the strengths as well as we don't call them weaknesses, we call them concerns, but the strengths and concerns of the congregation. They'll make recommendations to leadership as to how to address all these things that they've discovered. And that's a part of this church self-study. The goal will be to increase the church's health, unity, and readiness to move forward under a new resident pastor. That is always the goal out in front of us. The goal is never... One of our men was accused one time of dragging his feet so slowly because he didn't want to go back to his home. He wanted to stay at the church that he was at. We don't do that. It's not that we don't love you. We expect to grow to love you very deeply, and we expect our parting to be one of those bittersweet things. But we know we're only here temporarily. And so there is a goal in sight. There's an end in sight. And we will move through this process and get to that goal as quickly as possible, because my goal is for y'all to have a new pastor who is going to lead you for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, whatever it may be. And so that goal is always out there in front of us. The third step is to facilitate action. In other words, they'll provide, the transition team continues to function even after they've come up with their report. If ongoing conflict counseling and mediation, the team will work with that, the elders would work with that, your pastoral staff would work with that, whatever that may be. But the elders, the staff, and other leaders begin implementing those recommendations. It does no good. You've all seen it in your work environment, if not here in the church, but you've all seen a situation where some group spends hours and hours and hours coming up with recommendations, and they submit their report, and whoever they submit it to says, well, thank you very much, and it's never brought up again. Can I identify with that? Yeah, okay. Wanted to make sure I was speaking to the choir there. And so the elders, the staff, and other leaders, including the team, will begin to implement some of their recommendations. During this period of time, the leadership will do a review of the staffing needs, the organizational structures. Now, praise God, you guys are part of the PCA, so we don't have to go back and look over BCO. We're not going to try to rewrite BCO. That's an area that we really don't need to deal with. But you do have things here like job descriptions and standard operating procedure. You've got some of those. Part of my job is just look over those with you, or with the leadership, and to do an evaluation of them. You don't have a church constitution as such. It's, again, PCA. We don't have to deal with that kind of issue. You may have operating policies that we'll look at. We'll look at your organizational structure and see if there's a better way that you can be organized, not just because it's, quote, a better way, or not just because Jim thinks it's a better way, but is there a better way to be organized in order to accomplish the goals that you want to accomplish? Your organizational structure needs to reflect what your goals are, and those goals need to be what God would have you have as goals, so they're not just yours. So we'll be doing that during this facilitate action stage. The fourth stage then will be the strategic planning, and this is kind of where everybody wants to get to. They want to start doing the planning. They want to say, okay, let's move on. The first stuff. Yeah, I was at a church one time where I happened to have an office across the street on the fourth floor of a building, an office building, and I could look across the highway and I could see major construction. I mean, we were doing major construction in this church, and I could sit there in my office and I could watch them, and it literally took months and months and months and months, and it seemed like all they were doing was pushing dirt around. And I know they were doing more, but it seemed like that's all that they were doing. It took months before you could start to see progress. Okay, well, that's kind of what these first three steps are. That's kind of the groundwork. That's laying groundwork. And now we get into this strategic planning, and that's when we begin to say, okay, here's the blueprint, and here it's going to now start to come, we're going to start to see how it comes into play, how it comes into focus. So strategic planning, that begins when the elders and the staff and any other leaders agree that the key issues have been resolved. We cannot do strategic planning as long as there are key issues, whatever they might be, that are unresolved, because we won't move forward as a unit. And so they have to resolve those first. The transition team will engage in a vision pathway. That's not a technical term. It's just trying to give you a mental picture of something. Process clarifying the church's missions, purpose, and core values. Those may not change from anything that you already have. Okay, but we want to make sure that they're clarified. And the goal is to develop a provisional vision and ministry plan for the next several years. I don't know when your mission statement and your vision statements were all done. They ought to be revisited. I think the standard in the industry is about every 5 years. Not because you could change everything up, but you need to revisit them because circumstances change and people change. you as individuals change, and the composition of this body changes. And so what may have been true 5 years ago is not necessarily the same today. So we'll look at that. And then 5, the one that we're all, this is the one that we really can't wait to get to, is the search. Begin looking for that. So there'll be the selection, and I will provide training. If you want me to, I will provide training for the pastoral search team. I know you guys have never called a pastor before. Have any of you been in another church where you've served on a pastoral search team? Maybe half a dozen. Okay, that's kind of typical. And so, you all may end up being a major part of the search team. I don't know who that's going to be, but it's very, very typical to have search teams that in their first meeting they kind of look at each other and say, well, okay, what do we do now? And so that's part of my job, is to help coach that. So I'll do whatever training seems appropriate for the pastoral search team. I'll coach and resource them in their search process. I don't direct, I don't chair, but I do coach and provide whatever resources I can for them. And that can involve giving my professional opinion on resumes that have come in, what I think as I've read through it, because the truth of the matter is nobody's going to send out a bad resume, at least not intentionally. It's like, I chuckle all the time. I mean, you all did it for me, and it's standard, but you always ask for references. I tell you, I've never given somebody's name as a reference that I know is not going to give me a good reference. So it's kind of the same here. Nobody's going to write in a resume, well, I'm really lousy at such and such and such and such. They're going to tell you what they're good at and what they feel their strengths are and such. And so sometimes simply having someone like a Jerry or someone like me who is a pastor themselves is it's really helpful in maybe getting some insight between the lines as to what's going on. So I'll be available for that, providing resources. Where do you get the names? Well, obviously your PCA, so you file a ministerial or a church data form with the stated clerk's office. But do you want to do any more than that? Well, there's a lot more that you can do if you want to. So I would work through with the team on that, and then work through with them the selection. And I stress, because people get frightened about this, the team makes the selection. I don't. I'll give whatever input they want. I try to really stay out of it. If for whatever the reason, let me just give you an off-the-cuff illustration. If for whatever the reason, if the team is moving really strongly in a direction of calling someone, say, here to Mount Airy, who's a Baptist Pentecostal, I'm probably going to do everything that I can to say that's probably not a real wise choice, and to help them work through why it's not a real wise choice. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I've read you wrong. Maybe that would be a great choice. But I'm not seeing any response, so I'm not sure where maybe I've stepped into some doggy do or something there. I don't know. But that's the kind of thing we're talking about that will help with the selection. Will help with the process of calling, because there is a process. Some of it's spelled out in the BCO. Some of it has to do more with just how do you treat people. There's nothing. Again, this will go over with the search team, but just to give you an idea of the kind of insight that our men bring, it's a very, let me say it this way, it's very discouraging for me as a pastor to fill out, whether it's online, and that's the way most of it's done today, but to take the time to fill out online a resume and submit it to Mount Airy Presbyterian Church for their senior pastor position, and I don't hear another word for 4 to 5 to 6 months. I personally think that's unacceptable. Okay? And especially in the age that we live today with communication. I mean, I remember filling out forms. You had to send them by snail mail, and so it was at least 3 weeks before they got your letter, and they had time to send you a letter back. But we don't have that anymore. And so helping them to work through that calling, helping with the installation process, ordaining if the person needs to be ordained. That's not up to me, that's up to Presbyterian, but nevertheless doing that. And then the onboarding, That means getting him up here. The ideal situation is this. I won't say it happens all the time, but it's what we aim for, is that on the Sunday when he's going to be here for his first Sunday, that I'll be up here, I'll start the service sometime during the service. I'll literally hand him a baton in a bit of a service ceremony, passing off the responsibilities to him, and I will leave the stage and the podium, and Brooke and I and Cricket will probably leave the auditorium because he's your new pastor. That's how it's designed to work. Does it every time? No, there are all kinds of circumstances that can arise. But that's what we talk about onboarding, bringing him on board. Okay. So my goals, that's nothing new. It's what I already showed you. I think that's the last slide. Yep. Okay, so I'll leave that up there and answer any questions that you may have to the best of my ability. Oh, good, there are none. Yeah, go ahead.
Times have you conducted this kind of transition now?
This would be the second one. One of the things that IPM provides for me, for any interim who's out here like this, is a more seasoned interim as a coach. So I will have a coach that I'm in contact with every couple of weeks. May or may not be the same one I used in the first one, but I'll be in touch with him every couple of weeks. He's doing a couple of things. He's making sure that I'm staying on track in the process, but he's also there to share his wisdom, because in most cases he's already done 5 or 6 or 7 of these transitions. So we're not out. I'm not out there alone. And if I need, I talk to him every other week or so. If I need something, I've always got the option to call. And then I've got a resource library through IPM that I have access to that gives me all kinds of information that I need. That if I need it, I can access it. Good question. Depends which child you ask. We've got 2 sons, and we all live in the same town. Yeah, and our 8.5 grandchildren all live in that. Well, the one's in college, but the other 7.5 all in that town. Our older, and it's our older son. We own a house in that town. We had leased it, and the lease hasn't run out yet, and so we're actually living with our one son's family until the Lord opens up something here or somewhere else. But she's got 3 at home. She and their 3 our 3 granddaughters there. They don't want us to leave the end of February or whatever. I mean, they want us to stay. And our son, has a job in construction, and he's actually out in Texas right now, so he's not home. The other son and daughter-in-law, they love to have us around. They've got little ones, 4 little ones with a 5th one on the way, and but they know this is what I do. They know I'm a minister, and they know. They say, Dad, you're well fitted for this. You've got gifts and talents, and you got the experience for it. So, and here's the beauty of it. We're only 5.5 hours away, and so IPM does want us to take a week off every 13 weeks that we're here, we tend to try to do that. But being only 5.5 hours away, we can get away for a day or 2 even, and go back and see them if we need to. So that's nice. To us, it's not very far. I grew up. I don't know if I mentioned this. Now, Brooke grew up outside Philadelphia, so it's not that far from her hometown. I grew up in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, just up US 15, through Gettysburg, and you're there, or just about there. And so we almost feels like coming home to us. Okay. You're going to ask something?
I was just going to ask, how large was the last church where you were serving as an interim?
Well, that was one that was they were just coming out of COVID, and I would say their attendance averaged between 70 and 95. Is that fair, Brooke? Their attendance averaged between 75 and 90. They had a larger role than that, Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes.
While we have, I guess, visiting pastors.
I'm sorry,
Sorry, while we have visiting pastors coming in, will you be here, like, I guess, I don't know, I don't understand quite. I know you're gonna be, if you decide to take this, if we decide to have you, all that kind of stuff works out, will there be other pastors coming in to speak?
I'm going to step out a little bit here, but I think that I speak faithfully in saying no. That you'll continue to use some of your guest pastors until we get the logistics worked out for us to move here. But once I'm here, I will be carrying the predominant part of the preaching. Jerry will be doing some of the preaching. Where to get to? He's up front. Jerry will continue to do some of the preaching, but we will not be bringing in guest preachers. Am I right in this, Jeff? To fill the pulpit. I'm not saying they won't bring any guests in, because I think there's value in hearing from somebody else too. But there won't. No, I'll be carrying that primary responsibility.
Maybe when you go home for a week.
Well, we'll be home for a week. Yeah, I'm assuming Jerry will preach, or one of the elders perhaps. But that's up to the session what they want to do for those any time that I'm out of the pulpit. Okay.
The projected start date would be March 8th.
And that's a presbytery thing. I don't know if you know it or not, but one of the advantages of being part of the PCA and part of the presbytery is that any man that you call, even for me being called as an interim, I have to go before presbytery here. I have to be examined by them. When you call a man as your new resident pastor, whether he's ordained already or not, he will have to appear before presbytery, and they will examine him as to his as to a lot of things, but particularly as to his creedal orthodoxy, so that they're doing what they can to guarantee that you're going to get a man who's going to teach the word the way that you've always been taught it from a good, solid, reformed basis.